Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Find a comfortable position, allow your breathing to slow, and let the day begin to fade into the background. If you enjoy calm, factual stories about ancient history, deep time, and the long story of life on Earth, you may wish to like this video or subscribe to the channel. It quietly helps others find these stories as well. You don't need to do anything right now. You can always return to it later. For now, simply listen. Tonight, we'll explore a real scientific question that has occupied researchers for decades. Why did so many large animals go extinct at the end of the last ice age? And to begin, imagine yourself in a very different world. Picture this. You're standing on a grassy plain somewhere in what will one day be called North America. But right now, 15,000 years ago, it's simply the edge of the world, as any living creature knows it. The air is cold, crisp, carrying the scent of sage and distant pine. The sun hangs low on the horizon, casting long shadows across a landscape that would seem both familiar and utterly alien to modern eyes. In the distance, a herd moves slowly across the valley. But these aren't bison, though bison are here too. These are mammoths, Colombian mammoths to be precise, standing nearly 14 feet tall at the shoulder, their curved tusks gleaming in the fading light. Each one weighs as much as a dozen pickup trucks. Their footfalls shake the ground. When they trumpet, the sound carries for miles, a deep resonant call that speaks of power, of permanence, of a world where such giants have wandered for millions of years. Beyond them, you might spot something even stranger. A creature that looks like it was assembled from spare parts. A ground sloth the size of an elephant, moving with deliberate slowness through a grove of trees, reaching up with massive clawed arms to strip branches of their leaves. And there, near the tree line, a pair of saber-toothed cats watch the herd with calculating patience, their elongated canines catching the last rays of sun. This was the world of Ice Age megafauna, a world populated by giants, animals so large, so dominant, so seemingly indestructible that their existence appeared eternal. For millions of years, massive mammals, birds, and reptiles roamed every continent except Antarctica. They shaped landscapes, influenced vegetation patterns, and formed the backbone of complex ecosystems that had evolved over deep geological time. And then, in what amounts to a geological eye blink, they were gone. Between roughly 50,000 and 10,000 years ago, depending on where you look, the majority of Earth's large-bodied animals vanished. Not gradually, replaced by successor species through the normal churn of evolution. They simply disappeared, leaving behind only bones and a profound silence in the ecosystems they once dominated. The scientific term for this event is the late quaternary megafaunal extinction, though it's often simply called the megafauna extinction or the Ice Age extinction. It represents one of the most dramatic losses of animal diversity in the past 65 million years, rivaling some of the great extinction events preserved in the fossil record. But unlike the extinction of the dinosaurs, caused by a catastrophic asteroid impact, the megafauna extinction has no single obvious cause, no smoking gun, no global catastrophe written clearly in stone. Instead, what we have is a mystery, a scientific puzzle that has occupied researchers for over a century, generating heated debates, competing theories, and gradually, through painstaking work, a more nuanced understanding of what happened during those crucial millennia at the end of the Pleistocene epoch. When we talk about megafauna, we're generally referring to animals with body masses over 44 kilograms, about 97 pounds, though the definition varies slightly depending on who you ask. But the creatures we're really concerned with, the ones whose loss transformed ecosystems, were much larger. Mammoths and mastodons weighing several tons, ground sloths the size of modern elephants, giant short-faced bears that stood over 11 feet tall on their hind legs, glyptodons, armored mammals resembling Volkswagen-sized armadillos, dire wolves, giant beavers the size of black bears, camels, horses, giant tortoises, massive flightless birds. The list goes on and on. Over 178 species of large mammals went extinct during this period. In North America alone, 34 genera of large mammals disappeared. South America lost even more. Australia lost all of its giant marsupials and massive reptiles. Even Europe and Asia, which fared somewhat better, still lost significant portions of their megafaunal diversity, including mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, and cave bears. So what happened? Why did so many large animals, survivors of previous climate changes, veterans of millions of years of environmental challenges, suddenly fail? Why did creatures that had weathered multiple glacial cycles, that had adapted to ice ages and warm periods alike, vanish so completely? For decades, scientists have debated two primary hypotheses. The first points to climate change, the rapid warming at the end of the last glacial period that transformed habitats, altered vegetation patterns, and fundamentally restructured ecosystems. The second points to humans, the newly arrived superpredator, whose expansion across the globe closely correlates with waves of extinction. But here's what makes this mystery so compelling and so frustrating. Neither explanation, on its own, fully accounts for what we observe in the fossil record. Climate change alone cannot explain why extinctions occurred unevenly across continents, why some regions lost their giants millennia before others, or why certain animals vanished while closely related species survived. Human hunting alone cannot explain the complexity of the extinction patterns, the variation in timing, or the survival of some megafauna in regions where humans were abundant. The truth, as research over the past few decades has increasingly shown, is more complex, more interesting, and more unsettling than either simple explanation suggests. What killed the megafauna was not a single factor, but a deadly combination. Climate change rendering animals vulnerable, human activity adding pressure to already stressed populations, and cascading ecological effects that made recovery impossible. Small impacts accumulating over centuries, pushing species past tipping points they couldn't retreat from. Tonight, we're going to walk through this mystery step by step. We'll travel across continents and millennia. We'll meet the scientists piecing together clues from bones, pollen, ancient DNA, and archaeological sites. We'll explore how large animals shaped their worlds and what happened when they were suddenly absent. We'll examine the evidence, weigh the theories, and come to understand why the question, what killed the Ice Age giants, doesn't have a simple answer, but rather a web of interconnected causes that varied from place to place, species to species, continent to continent. So settle in, dim the lights, and let's step back into a world that no longer exists to understand why it vanished and what that vanishing tells us about the fragility of life itself, even life that seems, on the surface, too large and too powerful to ever disappear. The world of Ice Age. Megafauna. Before we can understand what was lost, we need to grasp what existed. The world of the late Pleistocene, particularly between 50,000 and 15,000 years ago, was dramatically different from today, not just in climate, but in the sheer scale and diversity of its animal life. Start in North America. The continent was split by vast ice sheets, the Laurentide covering much of Canada and the northern United States, the Cordilleran ice sheet along the western mountains. But south of the ice, conditions were actually fairly hospitable, if colder and often drier than today. And wandering these landscapes were creatures that would seem fantastical if we didn't have their bones. The most iconic, of course, were the proboscideans, the elephants, and their relatives. The Columbian mammoth, Mammothus columbi, ranged across the southern half of North America, preferring relatively temperate grasslands. These animals were enormous, larger than modern African elephants, with adult males potentially reaching 13 to 14 feet at the shoulder and weighing up to 10 tons. Their tusks curved dramatically, sometimes reaching over 16 feet in length. Further north, in the colder regions near the ice sheets, lived their cousins, the woolly mammoths, Mammothus primigenius. These were slightly smaller but more cold-adapted, covered in thick fur and possessing smaller ears and shorter tails to minimize heat loss. Woolly mammoths are perhaps the most famous of all extinct megafauna, preserved occasionally in permafrost with skin, hair, and even stomach contents intact, giving us an intimate portrait of their lives. And alongside the mammoths walked the mastodons, Mammoth americanum, more forest-dwelling cousins with straighter tusks and teeth adapted for browsing on woody vegetation rather than grazing grass. Where mammoths dominated open habitats, mastodons thrived in woodlands and along forest edges. But the elephant relatives were just the beginning. North America's grasslands and woodlands hosted an incredible diversity of large herbivores. Multiple species of horses, ancestors of modern horses but extinct in the Americas until Spanish reintroduction. Several species of camels, yes, camels, which actually originated in North America before spreading to Asia and South America. 4 species of ground sloths, including Jefferson's ground sloth and the enormous Shasta ground sloth, lumbering creatures that could rear up to reach high vegetation. There were also massive bison, larger than their modern descendants, shrub oxen, stocky grazers related to muskoxen, the strange flat-headed peccary, American lions, larger than modern African lions, dire wolves, heavier and more robust than modern grey wolves, the short-faced bear, Arctodus simus, possibly the largest terrestrial carnivore of its time, with long legs suggesting it was a pursuit predator or scavenger capable of covering vast distances. And the really strange stuff, giant beavers, Castoroides ohioensis, weighing up to 220 pounds, roughly the size of modern black bears, giant capybaras, the American cheetah, a fast-running cat that may have driven the evolution of the pronghorn antelope's remarkable speed. Now shift your perspective south to South America. Here, the megafaunal diversity was even more remarkable, a result of the continent's long isolation before the formation of the Isthmus of Panama connected it to North America about 3 million years ago. South America was the realm of the xenothrans, the sloths, armadillos, and their relatives. Giant ground sloths reached truly staggering sizes. Megatherium americanum, the giant ground sloth, stood over 12 feet tall when upright and weighed as much as 4 tons. These animals had massive curved claws, probably used for pulling down tree branches, but also formidable defensive weapons. And then there were the glyptodons, essentially giant armadillos, with fused armor plating forming a solid dome over their bodies. Some species, like Doedicurus, were the size of small cars, weighing over a ton, with a club-like tail covered in bony spikes. Picture an armadillo built on the scale of a rhinoceros, and you're getting close. South America also had its own unique large mammals. Toxodon, a vaguely hippo-like creature with features suggesting a strange mixture of rhino, hippo, and giant rodent. Macrauchenia, a long-necked animal with a trunk-like nose that looked like someone crossed a llama with a small elephant. Multiple species of giant capybaras and strange hoofed mammals found nowhere else. When predators did evolve to challenge these giants, they were formidable. Smilodon, the saber-toothed cat, reached its largest size in South America. The terror birds, massive flightless predators with enormous beaks, still survived in some regions, though they were past their prime. Cross the ocean to Australia, and the megafauna becomes even stranger. Australia's large animals were almost exclusively marsupials and reptiles, products of tens of millions of years of isolated evolution after the continent split from Antarctica and drifted north. The largest marsupial ever to exist, Diprotodon optatum, lumbered through Australian woodlands. About the size of a modern rhinoceros, weighing perhaps 2.5 tons, it looked vaguely like a giant wombat with elongated features. Multiple species of giant kangaroos, some of which didn't hop but walked on 2 legs, stood over 6 feet tall. Giant wombats, enormous koalas, and the marsupial lion, Thylacoleo carnifex, a powerful predator with blade-like slicing teeth and possibly the strongest bite force relative to body size of any mammal. But Australia's reptiles were equally impressive. Megalania prisca, a giant monitor lizard that may have reached lengths of over 20 feet and weighed up to 1,500 pounds, making it the largest terrestrial lizard ever known. Giant tortoises, massive crocodiles in the northern waterways, and birds. The thunderbirds, massive flightless species in the genus Genyornis, stood over 6 feet tall and weighed potentially 600 pounds or more. Europe and Northern Asia had their own megafaunal assemblage, one that actually persists in reduced form today. Woolly mammoths ranged across the Mammoth Steppe, a vast grassland ecosystem that stretched from Spain to Beringia. Woolly rhinoceroses, Chelodonta antiquitatis, grazed alongside them, their thick fur and stocky build adapted for harsh cold. Cave bears, enormous hibernating omnivores. Giant deer, Megalocorus giganteus, with antlers spanning over 11 feet from tip to tip, the largest antlers ever to evolve. There were also cave lions, slightly larger than modern lions. Steppe bison, the ancestors of modern European and American bison. Muskoxen ranged much further south than today, and in more temperate refugia, straight-tusked elephants, Paleoloxodon antiquus, possibly the largest land mammal ever to exist in Eurasia, even larger than mammoths. What's crucial to understand is that these weren't just random large animals. They were ecosystem engineers, creatures whose very existence shaped the world around them. Mammoths and mastodons knocked down trees, creating and maintaining grasslands. Their dung spread seeds across vast distances. Ground sloths dispersed the seeds of plants that depended on them, creating relationships that evolved over millions of years. Giant herbivores kept vegetation grazed down, preventing the encroachment of forests into grasslands. Predators controlled herbivore populations, preventing overgrazing. Scavengers like short-faced bears cleaned up carcasses, recycling nutrients. Even the digging behavior of giant ground sloths created burrows that served as refugia for smaller animals. These animals didn't just live in their environments. They created them, maintained them, and in doing so, shaped the very structure of Pleistocene ecosystems. Plant communities evolved in response to megafaunal grazing and browsing. Smaller animals evolved to exploit niches created by larger ones. The entire system functioned as an integrated whole, with the megafauna at its core. And this system was ancient. The megafaunal communities of the late Pleistocene were the products of millions of years of evolution. Many of these genera had existed through multiple glacial-interglacial cycles, adapting to swings between cold and warm, dry and wet, grassland and forest. They were survivors, tested by time and climate change, products of deep evolutionary histories, which makes their disappearance all the more striking. These weren't fragile specialists living on the edge of viability. These were robust, adaptable, successful animals, some with ranges spanning entire continents, populations likely numbering in the hundreds of thousands or millions. They had weathered multiple climate shifts before. They had adapted to predators, to changing vegetation, to competitors, and yet, between 50,000 and 10,000 years ago, most of them vanished. In Australia, it happened earlier, between 50 and 40,000 years ago. In North America, the collapse was more concentrated, primarily between 13,000 and 10,000 years ago, though some species had disappeared earlier. In South America, extinctions occurred in waves. Europe and Asia saw more gradual declines, with some species persisting until surprisingly recent times, mammoths surviving on isolated Arctic islands until about 4,000 years ago. The question isn't just why they went extinct, it's why they went extinct then, after surviving so much, after proving their adaptability over such deep time, and why the pattern varied so much from place to place, suggesting that whatever happened, it wasn't a simple, universal cause. To answer that question, we need to understand two things: what was changing in the environment at the end of the Ice Age, and who else was showing up in places they'd never been before. Timeline of disappearances, an uneven catastrophe. One of the most compelling aspects of the megafaunal extinction event is its unevenness. This wasn't a single catastrophic moment. No asteroid strike wiping out giants across the globe in a geological instant. Instead, extinctions occurred in waves, pulses, and gradual declines that varied dramatically from continent to continent, and even from region to region within continents. Understanding this pattern, this mosaic of extinction timing, is crucial to understanding what caused it. If extinctions had occurred simultaneously worldwide, we might look for a single global cause, but the staggered nature of the losses suggests something more complex, causes that varied by location, by ecology, by the specific circumstances of each region. Let's start in Australia, because Australia's story began earliest and illustrates the mystery most clearly. Australia's megafauna extinctions occurred primarily between 50,000 and 45,000 years ago, though dating remains somewhat contentious, and some researchers argue for a more protracted decline extending to 30,000 years ago or even later for some species. But the general pattern is clear. Australia lost its giants first, and lost them relatively quickly once the process began. The fossil record shows that before 50,000 years ago, Australia hosted a full complement of megafauna. Giant wombats, enormous kangaroos, the rhinoceros-sized diprotodon, the marsupial lion, the giant lizard megalania, the thunderbirds. And then, within a relatively short span, most of them disappeared. What makes the Australian extinction particularly interesting is its apparent coincidence with human arrival. The best current evidence suggests humans first reached Australia sometime between 65,000 and 50,000 years ago, possibly arriving by boat from Southeast Asia during a period of lowered sea levels that created closer island stepping stones, but still required open water crossings. The correlation is striking. Humans arrive, and within perhaps 10,000 years, most of Australia's large animals are gone. This has led many researchers to strongly suspect human involvement, either through direct hunting or through indirect environmental modification, particularly the use of fire. But the climate was also changing. Australia was experiencing increasing aridity as the Pleistocene progressed, with lakes drying, vegetation shifting, and resources becoming more patchy and unpredictable. So even in Australia, with its seemingly clear signal of human arrival followed by extinction, we can't entirely rule out climate stress as a contributing factor. Move forward in time and across the world, to the northern continents, and the picture becomes murkier. In Eurasia, extinctions occurred over a much longer time frame and were more gradual. Woolly mammoths, for instance, survived on the Eurasian mainland until roughly 10,000 years ago. But even that hides complexity. In some regions, mammoths had declined sharply much earlier. In others, they persisted in good numbers until the very end of the Pleistocene. What's particularly interesting about Eurasia is that humans had lived alongside many of these megafaunal species for tens of thousands of years without causing extinction. Modern humans reached Europe by at least 45,000 years ago, encountering ecosystems already populated by Neanderthals and megafauna that had coexisted with various human species for hundreds of thousands of years. The cave bear, for example, went extinct around 24,000 years ago, well before most other megafaunal extinctions in Europe. Giant deer survived until about 7,000 years ago in some regions. Woolly rhinoceros disappeared around 14,000 years ago. The pattern is messy, scattered across both time and space. This suggests that in Eurasia, unlike Australia, the human factor was different. These animals had evolutionary experience with humans and had adapted behavioral responses to human predation. The extinction pattern looks less like a naive population encountering a novel predator, and more like populations under multiple stresses gradually succumbing over time. The Americas present perhaps the most dramatic and contentious extinction pattern. For decades, the timing of human arrival in the Americas was thought to be firmly established. The Clovis culture, recognizable by distinctive stone spear points, appeared in North America around 13,000 years ago, and shortly after, North American megafauna began disappearing rapidly. By about 10,000 years ago, 34 genera of large mammals were extinct. This seemingly tight correlation between Clovis arrival and extinction, compressed into perhaps 3,000 years or less, formed the basis of the Clovis overkill hypothesis, most famously championed by paleontologist Paul Martin. The idea was straightforward. Human hunters entered a continent packed with animals that had never encountered human predation. These naive animals were easy prey. Hunting them required no complex strategies, and human populations, expanding rapidly into resource-rich environments, could have driven species to extinction within centuries or even decades. But the picture has grown more complicated. Evidence for human presence in the Americas before Clovis has mounted steadily over the past few decades, sites like Monteverde in Chile, firmly dated to at least 14,500 years ago, prove humans were in South America before Clovis appeared in North America. Other sites, more controversially, suggest even earlier arrivals, potentially as early as 20,000 years ago or more. If humans were present earlier, why didn't extinctions occur earlier? Or did they, and we simply haven't recognized the pattern? In South America, the extinction pattern is particularly complex. Some megafauna clearly survived longer than in North America. There's evidence that ground sloths persisted in some regions until 8,000 years ago, or even more recently. Mastodons may have survived in remote areas until 7,000 years ago. The pattern is less of a rapid collapse and more of a regional mosaic, with extinctions occurring at different times in different places. This variation is exactly what you'd expect if extinctions resulted not from a single overwhelming cause, but from a combination of factors that played out differently depending on local ecological, climatic, and human population circumstances. Consider the temporal correlation more carefully. In North America, most extinctions are tightly clustered around the Younger Dryas period, a dramatic cold reversal that occurred between 12,800 and 11,700 years ago. For about a millennium, right in the middle of overall warming, temperatures plunged back toward glacial conditions. Ecosystems that had begun adjusting to warming suddenly faced renewed cold and aridity. The Younger Dryas was an ecological catastrophe for many species, and it coincided almost exactly with major megafaunal collapse in North America. But it also coincided with expanding Clovis populations. So what was the primary driver? Climate shock, human hunting, both. Different species went extinct at different times, even within this compressed window. Mammoths disappeared from most of North America by about 11,000 years ago, but survived on islands off Alaska until about 5,700 years ago, and on Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean until about 4,000 years ago. These island populations lived thousands of years after mainland extinction, in environments with no human presence, eventually dying out due to inbreeding, genetic decline, and shifting climate conditions that made their small habitat patches less viable. Horses vanished from the Americas by about 10,000 years ago, as did camels. Ground sloths held on somewhat longer in some regions. The giant short-faced bear seems to have gone extinct relatively early, possibly because it specialized in scavenging megafaunal carcasses, and as other megafauna declined, its food source vanished. The staggered timing suggests different vulnerabilities. Species with slower reproduction, more specialized diets, or smaller populations would have been more susceptible to any stress. Species with broader ecological tolerance, higher reproductive rates, or larger populations would have been more resilient. Africa stands as the great exception to the megafaunal extinction pattern. Africa lost relatively few species during the late Pleistocene. Yes, there were some extinctions, particularly among specialized grazers and large predators. But the overall pattern is one of survival. Elephants, lions, leopards, rhinoceroses, giraffes, hippos, zebras, dozens of antelope species, all persisted. Why? The most common explanation is that African megafauna evolved alongside humans, and thus had hundreds of thousands or even millions of years to adapt to human hunting pressure. By the time modern humans developed sophisticated hunting techniques, African animals had already evolved wariness and defensive behaviors. They weren't naive, but Africa's climate stability also mattered. While Africa experienced Pleistocene climate changes, they were generally less extreme than in higher latitudes. The continent maintained ecological refugia, where species could persist through unfavorable periods. And the sheer size and diversity of African ecosystems meant that even localized population crashes didn't necessarily lead to extinction. The island extinction pattern provides additional insights. Islands around the world, from Madagascar to New Zealand to the Caribbean, lost their large animals relatively recently, and in most cases, the timing clearly correlates with human arrival. Madagascar lost its elephant birds, giant lemurs, and pygmy hippos within a few thousand years of human settlement, which occurred shockingly recently, only about 2,000 years ago. New Zealand lost all of its giant moa species within a century or two of Polynesian arrival in the 13th century CE. Caribbean islands lost giant ground sloths and other large mammals within centuries of human settlement. The island pattern is so consistent, it's hard to argue against human causation in those cases. But islands are also ecologically fragile, with small populations more vulnerable to any disruption, and with limited space for animals to retreat to as conditions change. The clear human signal on islands doesn't necessarily translate directly to continents, where the ecological dynamics were more complex. So what does this mosaic of extinction timing tell us? First, it tells us there's no single global trigger. The extinctions didn't happen simultaneously, which rules out catastrophic events like supervolcano eruptions or asteroid impacts. Second, it suggests that vulnerability varied with ecological context. Continents where megafauna had long experience with humans, like Africa and Eurasia, saw fewer extinctions. Continents where humans arrived suddenly, like Australia and the Americas, saw more dramatic losses. Islands were particularly vulnerable, almost universally losing large animals soon after human arrival. Third, the timing suggests interaction between climate change and human impacts. Many extinction pulses coincide with periods of rapid climate change, the warm interstadials and cold stadials of the late Pleistocene, and with periods of human population expansion. Fourth, the pattern hints at thresholds and tipping points. Species didn't necessarily go extinct immediately when conditions worsened or humans arrived. They declined gradually, populations shrinking, ranges contracting, until they crossed some critical threshold from which recovery was impossible. Understanding extinction isn't just about identifying the final blow that killed the last individual. It's about understanding the cumulative stresses that reduced populations to unsustainable levels, the cascade of ecological changes that made recovery impossible, and the specific combinations of factors that varied from species to species and place to place. The uneven timing of megafaunal extinctions is not a frustrating complication that obscures the real cause. It is the evidence, the pattern that tells us what kind of explanation we need to look for. And that explanation, as we'll see, involves understanding both what was changing in the environment and what a newly arrived predator was doing to ecosystems across the world. The climate change factor, a world in flux. To understand why megafauna were vulnerable, we need to understand what was happening to their world. And the late Pleistocene was a period of dramatic, sometimes catastrophically rapid environmental change. The Pleistocene epoch, beginning about 2.6 million years ago, was characterized by repeated glacial-interglacial cycles, ice ages lasting roughly 100,000 years, punctuated by briefer warm periods of 10 to 15,000 years. During glacial periods, massive ice sheets, thousands of feet thick, advanced from the poles, locking up huge volumes of water and lowering sea levels by 300 feet or more. Coastlines expanded, land bridges emerged, and much of the northern continents became ice-locked wastelands. But between the ice and the tropics lay vast regions of cold but productive habitat. The Mammoth Steppe, stretching across northern Eurasia and into Beringia, was a unique ecosystem unlike anything existing today. Cold, dry grassland supporting immense herds of large herbivores. North America's Great Plains were colder and more extensive than today, and adapted to these cold, often dry conditions were species that had evolved specifically for this type of environment. The megafauna we're discussing, most of them, had evolved during and adapted to glacial conditions. Woolly mammoths weren't just large elephants, they were specifically cold adapted, with thick fur, small ears, fat deposits, and physiological adaptations for conserving heat. Woolly rhinos, muskoxen, reindeer, all were products of cold Pleistocene environments. Then, starting roughly 20,000 years ago, the world began to warm. The last glacial maximum, the peak of the most recent ice age, gave way to deglaciation. Ice sheets began retreating, sea levels rose, and crucially, vegetation patterns shifted dramatically. This wasn't a smooth, gradual transition. The deglaciation was punctuated by rapid warmings, sudden cold reversals, and wild swings in precipitation. Climate records from ice cores and lake sediments reveal a world in climatic chaos, changing faster than at any point in the preceding 100,000 years. The Bulling-Alerud interstadial, between roughly 14,700 and 12,900 years ago, saw extremely rapid warming, perhaps 5 to 10 degrees Celsius in some regions, over just a few decades. Ecosystems scrambled to adjust. Then came the Younger Dryas, the cold snap mentioned earlier, when temperatures plunged back toward glacial conditions for over 1,000 years. Then warming resumed, even more rapidly, and by 11,000 years ago, the Holocene, our current warm period, had begun. For megafauna, adapted to stable glacial conditions, this was catastrophic. Consider vegetation. During glacial periods, much of the northern continents were covered by cold, adapted grasslands and tundra. These ecosystems supported massive herbivore populations. Mammoths, horses, bison, and other grazers converted the abundant grass and herb vegetation into protein, which in turn supported large predators. As the climate warmed, these grasslands began to change. In many regions, forests advanced, replacing open habitats with closed canopy woodlands. Trees that had been restricted to southern refugia during glacial periods expanded northward, following the retreating ice. For grazers adapted to open grasslands, this was problematic. Forests offer less accessible forage for large grazers. A mammoth needs vast quantities of grass and herbs daily, perhaps 300 pounds of vegetation. Forests don't provide that. Browsers like mastodons could exploit forests, but even they faced changes as the species composition of forests shifted. The Mammoth Steppe ecosystem essentially collapsed. The unique combination of climate, vegetation, and soil conditions that maintained this vast grassland disappeared. Where once there had been continuous habitat stretching thousands of miles, now there were fragmented patches separated by forests, wetlands, and shifting vegetation mosaics. For species with large home ranges and high food requirements, habitat fragmentation is deadly. Mammoths likely ranged over thousands of square miles, following seasonal patterns of vegetation growth. As suitable habitat shrank and fragmented, populations became isolated. Genetic diversity declined. Small, isolated populations are vulnerable to chance events, localized droughts, harsh winters, diseases. But it wasn't just habitat loss. It was habitat instability. Climate change wasn't happening once. It was happening repeatedly, oscillating between warm and cold, wet and dry, with shifts occurring on timescales of decades or centuries. For long-lived species with slow reproductive rates, this was perhaps the most damaging aspect. Mammoths, for example, had long generation times, similar to modern elephants. Females reached reproductive maturity around 10 to 15 years of age and gave birth to a single calf every 5 years or so. If environmental conditions deteriorated, a mammoth population couldn't respond quickly. They couldn't increase their reproductive rate or adapt rapidly through generational selection. Fast-breeding species like rabbits or mice can weather environmental changes through sheer reproductive output. If many die, survivors breed rapidly and populations rebound within years. But for megafauna, with decade-long generation times, a population crash might take centuries to recover from, if recovery was even possible. And climate change didn't just affect habitat directly. It affected the entire food web. Plant communities shifted in response to changing temperature and precipitation. Species that had grown together for thousands of years were suddenly separated as different plants responded differently to warming. Novel plant communities assembled, combinations that had never existed before. This meant herbivores faced vegetation they had no evolutionary experience with. Some plants became more abundant, others rarer. Nutritional quality of forage changed. The timing of plant growth, crucial for species that timed migrations and calving to match peak vegetation, became unpredictable. Phenological mismatches, where animals arrived at traditional feeding grounds before or after plants reached optimal growth, would have reduced survival and reproduction. Water availability shifted. Lakes that had been reliable for thousands of years dried up. Rivers changed course. Wetlands expanded in some areas and disappeared in others. For animals requiring water access, these changes could be fatal. Disease patterns likely shifted as well. As climates warmed, disease organisms and their vectors expanded into regions previously too cold for them. Megafauna, with no evolutionary exposure to these diseases, would have been vulnerable. We know from modern elephants that even minor disease outbreaks can devastate populations when combined with other stresses. Then there's the soil. Permafrost, frozen ground that had been stable for thousands of years, began thawing. In some regions, this created boggy, unstable terrain, difficult for large, heavy animals to navigate. Mammoths caught in these conditions sometimes became mired and died, which is part of why we have such good mammoth fossil preservation in some regions. The thermokarst landscape, characterized by irregular terrain of hummocks, ponds, and slumping ground, would have been treacherous for multi-ton animals. Modern elephants avoid unstable ground instinctively. Ice Age megafauna probably did too, but as warming progressed, stable ground became scarcer. Seasonal patterns became less predictable. The annual cycle that species relied on, the timing of spring green up, the duration of summer growth, the onset of winter, began shifting. For migratory species, this was particularly problematic. If they arrived at summer feeding grounds based on day-length cues that had been reliable for millennia, but the vegetation now greened up earlier or later due to temperature changes, they might miss the optimal feeding window. We can see these climate impacts clearly in the pollen record, preserved in lake sediments and peat bogs. By analyzing pollen from sediment cores, scientists can reconstruct past vegetation at remarkable temporal resolution, sometimes tracking changes decade by decade. These records show dramatic shifts. In Europe, the rapid replacement of cold-adapted steppe vegetation by forests. In North America, the northward march of tree species like spruce and pine, and the conversion of much of the Great Plains from mammoth steppe to mixed prairie. In Beringia, the transformation from productive grassland to less productive tundra and forest. The vegetation changes weren't uniform. Some regions changed rapidly, others more gradually. Some areas became more productive with warming, others less so. But the overall pattern is clear. The landscapes that megafauna had adapted to over millions of years were being fundamentally restructured within a few thousand years. Now, here's the crucial question. If climate change was the primary driver of extinction, why didn't megafauna go extinct during previous warm periods? This is where the climate change alone hypothesis encounters serious problems. The late Pleistocene warming that coincided with megafaunal extinction was not unique. There had been at least 20 similar glacial-interglacial transitions over the preceding 2 million years. Megafauna had survived all of them. Yes, species turnover occurred. Some species went extinct, others evolved, ranges shifted. But wholesale collapse of megafaunal diversity, that hadn't happened before. So what was different this time? Some researchers argue that this particular deglaciation was unusually rapid or extreme. There's some evidence for this. The warming was very fast in some regions, and the climate oscillations were particularly volatile. The Younger Dryas cold reversal, occurring right in the middle of deglaciation, may have been especially stressful, catching species already stressed by initial warming with a sudden return to harsh conditions. But other researchers point out that previous transitions also had rapid warmings and climatic reversals. The megafauna had proven remarkably resilient to climate change over millions of years. Why would this particular transition overwhelm them? The answer, increasingly, appears to be that climate change was necessary but not sufficient. It created vulnerability, stressed populations, reduced habitats, and decreased resilience. But something else pushed species over the edge. That something else walked on two legs. The human arrival correlation. A new predator emerges. While climate was transforming landscapes, another profound change was occurring across much of the world. Humans were expanding into regions they had never occupied before, and almost everywhere they went, megafaunal extinctions followed. The correlation is so striking that it's hard to dismiss as coincidence, but correlation doesn't prove causation, and the mechanism by which human presence led to extinction turns out to be far more complex than simple overhunting. Let's start with what we know about human expansion. Humans, or more specifically, our species Homo sapiens, evolved in Africa roughly 300,000 years ago. For most of that time, we remained in Africa and parts of the Middle East. Other human species, Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans in Asia, Homo erectus in parts of Southeast Asia, occupied much of the Old World. But starting around 70 to 60,000 years ago, modern humans began expanding out of Africa in larger numbers, carrying with them sophisticated tools, complex social organization, and behavioral flexibility that set them apart from other species. By 50,000 years ago, modern humans had reached Southeast Asia and were beginning to expand into new territories. Between 50 and 65,000 years ago, they reached Australia, requiring sophisticated boat building and navigation to cross significant ocean gaps. This makes humans the first megafaunal species to reach Australia in tens of millions of years. The timing of human arrival in Australia, approximately 50,000 to 65,000 years ago, coincides almost exactly with the primary pulse of Australian megafaunal extinction. Before human arrival, Australia's giants thrived. Within 10,000 years of human arrival, most were gone. Some species disappeared very quickly. The thunderbirds, Genyornis, show a particularly abrupt extinction around 45,000 years ago. One analysis of thousands of eggshell fragments found at sites across Australia shows continuous presence up to about that time, then sudden disappearance. Other megafauna may have taken longer, surviving in reduced numbers or refugia for additional thousands of years. In Eurasia, the pattern is different because humans had been present for a very long time. Archaic humans lived in Europe and Asia for hundreds of thousands of years. Megafauna that had evolutionary experience with human hunting. When modern humans arrived in Europe around 45,000 years ago, they were entering ecosystems where animals already knew to be wary of hominids. This might explain why Eurasian extinctions were more gradual and less severe. Animals that had never encountered humans, like Australia's megafauna, might not have recognized them as threats. They hadn't evolved flight responses. Archaeological evidence from Australia includes butchered remains of extinct megafauna, suggesting humans hunted them. But whether hunting was sustainable or excessive is debated. The American case is the most contentious and most cited in megafaunal extinction debates. For decades, the standard model held that humans first entered the Americas around 13,000 years ago, following an ice-free corridor between the Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets, or possibly traveling along the Pacific coast. The Clovis culture, appearing around 13,000 years ago, was thought to represent this first arrival. The Clovis people were sophisticated hunters. Their distinctive fluted stone points are found across North America, often in association with mammoth and other megafaunal kill sites. Sites like Blackwater Draw in New Mexico and Murray Springs in Arizona preserve clear evidence of Clovis hunters killing and butchering mammoths and other large animals. Paul Martin, the paleontologist who developed the overkill hypothesis, argued that Clovis hunters, entering a continent full of naive prey, could have driven species to extinction within centuries. His models showed that even modest hunting pressure, combined with rapid human population expansion, could produce extinction waves moving across the continent at hundreds of miles per generation. The appeal of this hypothesis was its simplicity and the tight temporal correlation. Clovis appears, and shortly after, megafauna disappear. It seemed like an open and shut case, but evidence has mounted that humans were in the Americas earlier than Clovis, possibly much earlier. The Monteverde site in Chile, excavated over decades and now widely accepted, dates to at least 14,500 years ago, well before Clovis. Other sites, like Bluefish Caves in Canada, Cheeky White Cave in Mexico, and several sites in South America, suggest even earlier human presence, potentially as early as 20,000 years ago or more. If humans arrived earlier, why didn't extinctions occur earlier? This is the puzzle that complicates the simple overkill model. One possibility is that pre-Clovis populations were very small, scattered, and had limited impact. Perhaps it wasn't until populations grew larger and hunting intensified that extinctions began. Another possibility is that extinctions did occur earlier in some regions. but we haven't detected them yet due to incomplete fossil records. A third possibility, increasingly supported by evidence, is that extinctions resulted not from a single wave of hunting, but from cumulative impacts of growing human populations combined with climate change over several thousand years. In South America, the pattern seems more protracted. Megafauna persisted longer in many regions. Ground sloths survived until at least 8,000 years ago in some areas. Mastodons hung on in remote regions. This suggests that whatever caused extinction, it wasn't an instant blitzkrieg of hunting. The island extinctions provide the clearest signal of human impact because they're so consistent. Madagascar, settled around 2,000 years ago, lost its elephant birds and giant lemurs within a few centuries. New Zealand, settled in the 13th century CE, lost all moa species within 100 to 200 years. Caribbean islands lost their ground sloths and other large animals within centuries of human settlement. These island cases are so clear-cut that they're hard to explain by anything other than human causation. But islands are also simpler ecosystems with smaller populations, more vulnerable to any perturbation. On continents, the signal is muddier because continental ecosystems are more complex, populations larger, and multiple factors are operating simultaneously. Let's consider what archaeological evidence actually tells us about human megafauna interaction. Kill sites, places where humans clearly hunted and butchered megafauna, exist but are relatively rare. In North America, there are several dozen confirmed Clovis mammoth kill sites. There are also sites with other megafauna, bison, mastodon, horse, but the total number of kill sites is small relative to the number of megafaunal individuals that must have existed. Does this mean hunting was rare and thus unimportant? Not necessarily. Taphonomy, the science of how organisms decay and fossilize, tells us that only a tiny fraction of kills would be preserved and discovered. Most carcasses would be completely scavenged, scattered, and obliterated. Finding even one kill site suggests many more occurred, but it also suggests that hunting wasn't so intensive that kill sites are everywhere. We're not looking at landscapes covered in butchered remains, the way you might expect from a true slaughter. Cut marks on bones provide another line of evidence. Many megafaunal remains from late Pleistocene sites show cut marks, proof that humans were processing these animals. But again, the frequency is relatively low. Most megafaunal remains don't show cut marks, suggesting many individuals died without human involvement. Projectile points embedded in bones are rare, but do exist. A mammoth rib from Washington State has a Clovis point embedded in it. A mastodon from Wisconsin had a stone point lodged in its skull. These are direct proof of hunting, but they're exceptional finds. What about evidence of mass kills, the driving of herds off cliffs or into bogs for wholesale slaughter? Some sites have been interpreted this way, but they're controversial. Most megafaunal accumulations appear to be natural deaths, animals dying in droughts, in harsh winters, or getting trapped in natural features. So the archaeological picture is one of humans definitely hunting megafauna, but not necessarily at levels that seem, on the surface, sufficient to drive extinction. This brings us to a crucial insight. Extinction doesn't require intensive hunting. It requires only that hunting exceeds the population's ability to replace losses. Megafauna had very low reproductive rates. A mammoth might produce one calf every 5 years. A giant ground sloth likely had similar rates. If a human group killed just a few individuals per year in a given region, that might not seem like much. But if those losses exceeded the births, the population would decline. And here's where climate change amplifies human impact. If climate stress had already reduced population sizes, decreased reproductive success, and fragmented habitats, even modest hunting pressure could be the difference between stable populations and decline. A mammoth population of 10,000 individuals in ideal conditions might easily absorb the loss of 100 animals per year to all causes: disease, accidents, predation, human hunting. But a population of 1,000, stressed by habitat loss and poor nutrition, losing 50 individuals per year to the same causes, might not recover. This is the concept of the extinction vortex, a feedback loop where declining populations become more vulnerable, leading to faster decline. Small populations have reduced genetic diversity, making them more susceptible to disease and environmental changes. They're more vulnerable to chance events, a particularly harsh winter, a drought, a wildfire, and they're more easily pushed over the edge by additional stresses like predation. Even without killing a single animal, humans could have impacted megafauna through competition. Humans hunted the same prey that megafaunal predators relied on. American lions, short-faced bears, saber-toothed cats. They all depended on healthy herbivore populations. If human hunting reduced these populations even slightly, it would have affected predator populations, possibly contributing to their decline. The archaeological record also shows humans used fire extensively to manage landscapes, which brings us to a crucial form of indirect impact that may have been even more important than hunting itself. Beyond simple hunting, indirect human impacts. When we think about humans causing megafaunal extinction, the image that comes to mind is often one of spear-wielding hunters bringing down mammoths. And while hunting certainly occurred and likely contributed to extinctions, it may not have been the most important way humans affected megafauna. The subtle, indirect impacts of human presence, landscape modification, competition for resources, and ecosystem disruption may have been far more devastating than direct killing. And these impacts didn't require large human populations or intensive hunting. Even small human groups living at low densities could have profound effects on ecosystems if those effects accumulated over centuries. Start with fire. Humans have used fire for hundreds of thousands of years, but the way we use it is unique in nature. We don't just respond to naturally occurring fires. We create them deliberately to clear land, to drive game, to promote the growth of preferred plant species, to reduce undergrowth and make travel easier. This is called landscape-scale burning, and its effects on ecosystems are transformative. When humans arrived in Australia, they brought with them a fire management tradition. Evidence from charcoal in sediment cores shows a dramatic increase in fire frequency after human arrival around 50,000 years ago. Prior to that, fires occurred primarily during lightning storms in dry seasons. After human arrival, fires became more frequent, smaller, and more widespread. These anthropogenic fires changed vegetation patterns. Fire-sensitive plants declined. Fire-adapted plants, particularly certain grasses and shrubs, expanded. Over time, the vegetation structure of Australia shifted, becoming more open, with fewer large trees and more fire-adapted scrubland. For megafauna adapted to specific vegetation communities, this was problematic. Browsers that fed on fire-sensitive trees and shrubs lost food sources. Animals requiring dense vegetation cover lost habitat, and the changes were widespread, affecting entire regions. But fire did more than change vegetation. it changed entire ecosystems' flammability and structure. Frequent low-intensity burns, the kind humans deliberately set, create, and maintain open habitats. They prevent the accumulation of fuel that would otherwise lead to intense, stand-replacing wildfires. This seems beneficial, but it's a double-edged sword. Many megafauna may have depended on habitat mosaics, patchworks of different vegetation, types and ages created by natural fire regimes. Human fire management created more homogeneous landscapes, potentially reducing habitat diversity. There's also evidence of fire use in the Americas. Charcoal records from lake sediments show changes in fire frequency, coinciding with human arrival and expansion. In some regions, fires became more common. In others, particularly after megafaunal extinction, fires actually decreased, possibly because the loss of megafauna changed vegetation in ways that altered fire dynamics. The mechanism might work like this. Megafauna maintained open habitats through grazing and browsing, keeping woody vegetation in check. When they disappeared, trees and shrubs expanded. Initially, this might have increased fires as the growing woody vegetation provided more fuel, but eventually, dense forests replaced grasslands, and forests tend to burn less frequently than grasslands, though more intensely when they do burn. Beyond fire, humans altered landscapes simply by their presence and activities. Humans created trails, which channeled movement and altered drainage. We established camps, which concentrated organic waste and nutrients, changing local soil chemistry and plant communities. We harvested plant resources selectively, potentially affecting the plants megafauna relied on. Think about seed dispersal. Many Pleistocene plants evolved to have their seeds dispersed by megafauna. Ground sloths, for instance, had enormous guts that could process large seeds, carrying them miles from the parent tree before depositing them in nutrient-rich dung. When ground sloths went extinct, these plants lost their primary dispersal agents. Some plants, called megafaunal dispersed fruits, have seeds so large that no surviving animal can effectively disperse them. Species like the Osage orange in North America, with its large grapefruit-sized fruits, likely evolved to be eaten by mastodons or ground sloths. After megafaunal extinction, these plants became reliant on water dispersal or just dropping seeds near the parent, dramatically reducing their ability to colonize new areas. Humans might have altered these plant communities not by directly removing plants, but by removing the animals that maintained them. This is an example of an indirect, cascading effect that wouldn't be immediately obvious, but would compound over time. Competition for resources takes many forms. Humans hunted many of the same animals that megafaunal predators depended on. Deer, bison, horses, camels. These were prey for American lions, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves, and short-faced bears. If human hunting reduced prey populations even modestly, predators would have felt the impact. Predators with specialized hunting strategies would be especially vulnerable. The saber-toothed cat's elongated canines were adaptations for killing large, thick-skinned prey. If such prey became scarcer, saber-tooths couldn't easily switch to smaller prey the way more generalized predators like wolves could. This might explain why saber-toothed cats went extinct while some wolves survived. The short-faced bear, possibly a specialized scavenger of megafaunal carcasses, would have been directly impacted by declining megafauna numbers. Fewer large herbivores meant fewer carcasses. A scavenger dependent on mammoth and bison carcasses would starve as those animals declined, even if the short-faced bear itself wasn't being hunted. There's also evidence of humans directly competing with megafauna for resources. Paleo-Indians clearly used many of the same water sources and productive habitats that megafauna concentrated in. During droughts or harsh seasons, when resources were scarce, this competition would have been most intense. Human camps near waterholes might have displaced megafauna, forcing them to travel further for water, expending more energy and increasing stress. Over time, this could reduce reproductive success and survival, especially for old, young, or sick individuals. Another often overlooked impact is disease. Humans carry diseases, and when we move into new environments, we bring pathogens with us. We also bring commensal species, animals that live alongside humans, dogs, rats, various insects and parasites. These hitchhiking species can introduce novel diseases to native wildlife. We know from modern examples that disease can devastate populations of animals with no prior exposure. The extinction of megafauna might have been facilitated in some cases by diseases introduced by humans or their domestic animals. There's no direct evidence for this. Diseases don't fossilize well, but it's a plausible contributing factor that would have worked synergistically with other stresses. Then there's the cumulative effect of all these impacts over time. If humans arrived in a region with small populations, their initial impact might have been minimal. But over centuries, as populations grew, as landscape burning became more extensive, as hunting accumulated, the cumulative effect would mount. A megafaunal population might initially seem stable despite human presence. But underlying trends, slightly reduced reproductive success, slightly increased mortality, slowly shrinking ranges, could be building toward collapse. By the time the population obviously declined, it might already be past the point of recovery. This is particularly likely for species with long generation times. Megafauna couldn't respond quickly to changing conditions. By the time a mammoth population recognized environmental decline through reduced calf survival, it might be decades before reproductive adjustments, if they even occurred, could affect population trajectory. The key insight is this: humans didn't need to be super predators waging war on megafauna. We simply needed to be an additional stress on populations already stressed by climate change. A few % increase in mortality here, a few % decrease in reproduction. There, habitat modifications that reduced carrying capacity, competition that made resource acquisition harder. All these small impacts, accumulating over centuries, could tip the balance from persistence to extinction. And once populations fell below certain thresholds, recovery became impossible even if the stresses were removed. This is called an allay effect, where small populations have reduced survival and reproduction simply because they're small. Individuals have trouble finding mates. Genetic diversity drops. Social structures break down. Cooperative behaviors become less effective. For social species like mammoths, which likely lived in matriarchal herds similar to modern elephants, the loss of experienced individuals would have been particularly damaging. Elephant matriarchs carry knowledge of where to find water during droughts, where to find food in hard times, how to navigate seasonal movements. Lose the matriarchs, and the herd loses that accumulated knowledge. If human, hunting preferentially targeted adults, which many hunting strategies do because adults are larger and provide more meat, it would disproportionately impact these knowledge-bearing individuals, further reducing population viability beyond just the numbers killed. So when we ask whether humans caused megafaunal extinction, the answer isn't simply yes or no. It's that human activity, even at modest levels, added to climatic stress in ways that pushed already vulnerable populations past their breaking points. The mechanism wasn't dramatic. It was grinding, cumulative, and took centuries to fully play out. And the ecological consequences of these extinctions would, in turn, create conditions that made recovery even less likely, locking ecosystems into new states from which there was no easy return. Megafauna as ecosystem engineers, giants that shaped worlds. To understand what was lost when megafauna vanished, we need to understand what they did when they were alive. These weren't just large animals passively grazing and browsing. They were ecosystem engineers, species whose very existence shaped the structure and function of their environments. The concept of ecosystem engineers comes from ecology. These are organisms that modify physical environments in ways that affect other species. Beavers are classic ecosystem engineers. Their dam building creates wetlands that host entire communities of organisms. But beavers are small compared to megafauna, and the scale of megafaunal engineering was correspondingly enormous. Start with the most direct impact. Megafaunal herbivores physically modified vegetation. A single adult elephant can consume 300 pounds of vegetation daily. They knock down trees, trample shrubs, dig up roots, and create trails through dense vegetation. One elephant is a major disturbance. Herds of elephants can transform forests into woodlands and woodlands into grasslands. Mammoths likely had similar impacts. In Siberia, mammoth steppe was maintained partly by mammoth grazing and browsing. Mammoths would have knocked down young trees before they could grow large, preventing forest encroachment. They would have trampled shrubby vegetation, favoring grasses. Their trails would have created networks through the landscape, channeling water flow and creating edges between habitat types. This isn't speculation. We can see these effects in modern analogues. African elephants actively shape their habitats, and in areas where elephant populations have been removed or reduced, vegetation structure changes dramatically. Grasslands become bushland, and open woodlands become dense forests. The same principle would have applied to Pleistocene mammoths, mastodons, and other mega-herbivores. Their removal would have initiated vegetation changes that unfolded over decades and centuries. Ground sloths, with their powerful clawed limbs, could pull down entire branches and even small trees. In woodlands, they would have created gaps in the canopy, letting light reach the forest floor and promoting understory growth. The paths they created would have facilitated movement for other animals. Giant bison and horses maintain grasslands through constant grazing. Unlike domestic cattle, which tend to overgraze favorite spots while ignoring others, wild herds move constantly, distributing grazing pressure more evenly and preventing any single area from being grazed to bare ground. This grazing maintained grassland diversity. Without it, competitively dominant plant species can take over, reducing overall diversity. Moderate grazing disturbance creates opportunities for many plant species to coexist. Then there's nutrient cycling. Megafauna moved nutrients across vast distances. A mammoth grazing in one area and defecating in another transported nutrients between locations. Over a mammoth's annual range of potentially hundreds of miles, this created flows of nitrogen, phosphorus, and other nutrients from areas where they were abundant to areas where they were scarce. Dung itself was a critical resource. Megafaunal dung piles were rich in nutrients and served as microhabitats for insects, fungi, and smaller organisms. dung beetles specialized in processing large mammal dung. Many plant seeds passed through megafaunal guts unharmed or even scarified, aided in germination, and were deposited in nutrient-rich packages ready to sprout. Some plants evolved specifically to exploit megafaunal dung for seed dispersal. The avocado, for instance, has a seed far too large for any surviving animal in its native range to swallow. It likely evolved to be dispersed by gomphotheres, elephant-like creatures that went extinct around 10,000 years ago. The Osage orange, Kentucky coffee tree, and several other North American trees have fruits suggesting megafaunal dispersal. After megafaunal extinction, these plants lost their primary dispersal agents. Some survived by clonal growth or limited dispersal, but their distributions shrank and their genetic diversity likely declined. Megafauna also influence fire regimes. Herbivore grazing reduces fuel loads, the accumulation of dead plant material that feeds wildfires. In grasslands, heavy grazing can actually reduce fire frequency and intensity by removing grass before it dries into tinder. Loss of megafaunal grazing would have increased fuel accumulation, potentially leading to more frequent or more intense fires in some regions. This, combined with human burning, could have created novel fire regimes that further altered vegetation. Consider also trampling. Large animals create disturbances simply by walking. They compact soil, create trails, uproot plants, and create microhabitats. These disturbances are important for many species. Some plants are disturbance specialists, germinating best in trampled, compacted, or recently disturbed soil. Without megafaunal trampling, these species would decline, replaced by plants less dependent on disturbance. Trails created by megafauna would have been used by many other species. Even today, in Africa, elephants create and maintain trail networks that other animals use extensively. These trails provide access to resources and function as corridors for movement. Waterholes are another critical feature. Elephants dig in dry riverbeds to access groundwater, creating waterholes that other species use. Mammoths likely did the same. During droughts, these artificial waterholes might have been the difference between survival and death for many species. Megafaunal wallowing behavior created and maintained small wetlands. Bison wallowing in the Great Plains creates depressions that fill with water during rains, providing habitats for amphibians, invertebrates, and plants. Mammoths, mastodons, and other large animals would have created similar features. Predators also play engineer roles. Large predators structure prey populations, often selectively removing weak, sick, or old individuals. This keeps prey populations healthy and prevents overgrazing in localized areas, as prey adjust their behavior to avoid predator-rich zones. Loss of top predators can lead to trophic cascades, where herbivore populations explode, overgraze vegetation, leading to erosion and ecosystem simplification. The extinction of large Pleistocene predators like American lions and short-faced bears would have removed this top-down control, potentially allowing herbivore populations to fluctuate more wildly. Even megafaunal carcasses were ecosystem engineering events. A dead mammoth represented several tons of meat, fat, and bone, a bonanza for scavengers. Carrion-dependent species, from beetles to bacteria, would have specialized in exploiting these massive resource pulses. Birds like condors and vultures specialized in soaring long distances to find carcasses. Their populations were likely supported by regular supplies of megafaunal remains. When megafauna disappeared, so did this predictable carrion source. potentially impacting scavenger populations. The bones themselves became resources. Predators gnawed them for minerals. Rodents gnawed them for calcium. Even after the soft tissues were gone, the skeleton provided materials and microhabitats for years. So megafauna weren't just large animals living in ecosystems. They were foundational species whose activities structured entire ecological communities. Plants evolved to exploit their dispersal services. Small animals depended on the habitats they created. Predators and scavengers specialized in exploiting them. Even microorganisms in soils adjusted to the nutrient pulses their dung provided. When megafauna went extinct, they took with them not just their own genetic diversity and evolutionary potential, but entire webs of ecological relationships. The ecosystems they left behind were fundamentally different, not just missing large animals, but restructured at every level. And these restructured ecosystems created conditions that made megafaunal recovery impossible, even if small populations had survived the initial extinction pulse. This is the concept of the extinction feedback loop, where ecological changes caused by extinction make recovery increasingly unlikely. Let's explore how these feedbacks worked. Feedback loops and cascading effects. The extinction spiral in extinction is rarely a simple event where a population declines to zero, and that's the end of the story. Instead, it's often a process involving multiple feedbacks, where ecological changes caused by declining populations further accelerate that decline, creating a spiral from which recovery becomes increasingly difficult and eventually impossible. The megafaunal extinctions triggered cascading effects that propagated through ecosystems, sometimes over centuries, creating conditions that would have prevented recovery even if some individuals had survived in refugia. Start with vegetation change. As megafaunal herbivores declined, vegetation patterns began shifting. With less grazing pressure, woody plants that had been kept in check began to expand. Grasslands started transitioning to shrublands, shrublands to woodlands, woodlands to forests. This sounds benign, perhaps even beneficial. More trees, more carbon sequestration. What's the problem? But for remaining megafauna adapted to open habitats, this was catastrophic. Grazing specialists like mammoths needed grasslands. As grasslands shrank and fragmented due to woody plant encroachment, mammoth habitat disappeared. This created a feedback. Fewer mammoths meant less grazing, which meant more woody plant growth, which meant even less suitable habitat, leading to further mammoth declines. In some regions, this vegetation change also affected fire regimes. With less grazing, more plant material accumulated as fuel. This could lead to more intense fires, which in turn affected vegetation structure and composition, creating novel plant communities, different from what had existed with megafauna present. These novel ecosystems might not have supported megafauna even if they returned. The plants might be less nutritious, or arranged in ways that make foraging difficult, or lack key species that megafauna depended on. Then there's the genetic problem. As populations shrink, genetic diversity declines. This isn't just an abstract concern. It has real survival consequences. Small populations are more vulnerable to inbreeding, where related individuals mate, increasing the chance of expressing harmful recessive traits. Inbred populations often show reduced fertility, higher juvenile mortality, and increased susceptibility to disease. They also have less ability to adapt to changing conditions. Genetic diversity is the raw material for evolution. Large populations with high genetic diversity can adapt to environmental changes through natural selection. Small populations with low genetic diversity lack this flexibility. The woolly mammoths on Wrangel Island, isolated from the mainland by rising sea levels around 10,000 years ago, survived until about 4,000 years ago. Genetic studies of these late mammoths show severe inbreeding and loss of genetic diversity. They accumulated harmful mutations and lost functional genes. By the time they went extinct, they were essentially genetic zombies, too inbred to adapt or even maintain basic biological functions effectively. This is the fate awaiting any small, isolated megafaunal population. Even if some survived the initial extinction pulse, their small numbers would doom them to eventual extinction through genetic decline, a process called genetic erosion. There's also demographic stochasticity, random variation in birth and death rates that affects small populations disproportionately. In a large population, random fluctuations average out. A particularly bad year kills extra individuals, but the population is large enough to absorb the loss. In a small population, the same bad year might kill a large fraction of remaining individuals, pushing them closer to extinction. For species like mammoths with slow reproduction, this is particularly deadly. If a population of 100 mammoths experiences a harsh winter that kills 30 individuals, and in the following breeding season only 5 calves are born, instead of the expected 10, the population drops from 100 to 75 in just 2 years. Recovery could take decades, and if another stochastic event hits before recovery, extinction becomes likely. This is called an extinction vortex, where small populations become increasingly vulnerable to further decline, accelerating toward extinction regardless of whether the initial stresses remain. The loss of ecosystem engineers created its own feedback loops. When mammoths disappeared, the grasslands they maintained began changing. Trees and shrubs encroached. The habitat became less suitable for other grazing species, which also declined. As they declined, the vegetation changed further. When ground sloths went extinct, the plants dependent on them for seed dispersal couldn't spread. Their populations became increasingly localized and fragmented. As these plants declined, other species that depended on them, perhaps for food or shelter, also suffered. When large predators disappeared, prey populations may have initially increased, but without predation pressure, they could overgraze habitats, leading to degradation that eventually caused their own populations to crash. These are called trophic cascades, where the removal of one level in the food web has rippling effects throughout the entire system. There's also the problem of minimum viable population size. For any species, there's a threshold below which recovery is unlikely or impossible, even if conditions improve. This threshold varies by species, but for large mammals with slow reproduction, it's often several hundred to several thousand individuals. Once a population falls below this threshold, it's functionally extinct, still present but doomed. The reasons are multiple: genetic problems, demographic stochasticity, allele effects, and simple bad luck. Allele effects describe situations where individuals do worse when populations are small. For social animals, small groups may be less effective at defense, foraging, or raising young. For wide-ranging animals, individuals may have trouble finding mates when densities are low. Mammoths, if they were like modern elephants, probably depended on matriarchal knowledge passed down through generations. Older females remembered where to find water in droughts, where to migrate seasonally, how to deal with dangers. If hunting or disease killed these experienced individuals, the entire population would suffer, not just from reduced numbers, but from lost knowledge. This cultural knowledge extinction means that even if a population recovered numerically, it might lack the behavioral knowledge necessary to survive. Young elephants raised without experienced elders make poor decisions that get them killed. The same would have been true for mammoths. So extinction wasn't just about numbers declining to zero. It was about ecosystems reorganizing into states that couldn't support megafauna, genetic diversity eroding to levels incompatible with survival, social structures collapsing, and behavioral knowledge being lost. Once these feedbacks began, they became self-reinforcing. Each step toward extinction made further extinction more likely. Small populations couldn't maintain their habitats, which made populations smaller. Declining genetic diversity reduced fitness, which reduced population growth. Lost knowledge made survival harder, which killed more individuals. And all of this was playing out over hundreds or thousands of years, making it nearly impossible for early humans to recognize that their activities were contributing to extinction. From any individual human's perspective, mammoths were simply becoming rarer. No one could see the long-term trend or understand the complex feedbacks at work. By the time extinction was obvious, it was far too late to reverse. By the early Holocene, the world had changed. Not suddenly, and not in a single moment anyone could point to, but gradually, almost imperceptibly. The landscapes that once supported towering herds and immense bodies had shifted into new forms. Forests replaced grasslands, shrubs filled open plains, ecosystems reorganized themselves around smaller, faster reproducing animals, better suited to a warmer, more fragmented world. The great giants did not vanish because of one cause, or one mistake, or one generation. They faded because many small pressures accumulated over long periods of time. Climate change altered habitats. Human expansion added new stresses. Populations shrank. Genetic diversity eroded. Social structures weakened. Knowledge disappeared. And once these processes began reinforcing one another, recovery became increasingly unlikely. From the perspective of deep time, the megafaunal extinction was not a catastrophe, but a transition. One stable world slowly gave way to another. For the animals living through it, there was no clear beginning or end, only gradual change and diminishing abundance. And for the humans who shared that world, there was no way to see the full picture. They lived within the process, not above it. They could not measure population trends across continents, or predict ecological feedback loops, or understand genetics. They experienced only what was immediately before them, a world that still seemed vast, still seemed full, even as it quietly emptied. Today, we know more. We can trace bones in the ground, read climate records in ice cores, and extract stories from ancient DNA. We can see patterns that were invisible to those who lived through them. But even now, the lesson of the Ice Age extinctions is not one of simple blame or sudden collapse. It is a lesson in how complex systems change slowly, how resilience can be lost without being noticed, and how extinction is often not a dramatic ending, but a long, quiet process of becoming unable to continue. And so, as the last mammoths disappeared from the tundra and the ground sloths faded from the forests, the earth did not stop. Life went on, adapting, reshaping, settling into a new balance. A world once filled with giants became a quieter place, and that quieter world is the one we inherited.